We're in Chapter 7, Part 3, The Rape of the Mind, The Psychology of Thought Control, Menticide, and Brainwashing by Just A.M. Merleau, M.D. Spy Mania. In totalitaria, this vicious cycle of vituperation reaches its fullest flowering. Drowned in a rain of suspicion, the citizen of totalitaria suffers from a terrible delusion of persecution. Spyonoia. That's what it says. Spyonoia, the spy mania. He is continually on the alert, watching his fellow men. His good neighbor may at any moment become a saboteur or a traitor. The citizen of totalitaria hardly ever looks for confusion or flaws in his own soul, but projects them onto scapegoats until he himself finally becomes the victim of someone else's spyonoia. Every citizen is constantly trying to search out everyone else's innermost thoughts, because one's own hidden thoughts are projected on one's own neighbors. Thinking in itself becomes the enemy. This great fear of the inner thoughts of our fellow men is related to a general process of paranoid reevaluation of the world as a result of fear and totalitarian thinking. In the denial of human loyalty and in the constant delusion of treason and sabotage are expressed the whole infantile mythology of totalitaria and its repudiation of mature human relationships. Through interrogation, character assassination, humiliation, mental terror, and demoralization, such as happens in individual and collective brainwashing, man can be so utterly demoralized that he accepts any political system. He is nothing anymore. Why should he oppose matters? In totalitaria, there is no open policy, no free discussion, no honest difference of opinion. There is only intrigue and denunciation, with their frightening action on the masses. The strategy of wild accusation is used not only against totalitaria's citizenry, but also against the rest of the world. Totalitaria needs the images of outside enemies, imaginary cruel monsters who spread plague and disease, to justify its own internal troubles. The remnants of the individual citizen's conscience are calmed and held in check by a paranoid attack on the rest of the world. The enemy is poisoning our food, throwing beetles and bacteria into our crops. This myth of an imaginary world conspiracy aims at bringing the fearful citizens of totalitaria into a concerted defense against non-existent dangers. It conceals at the same time internal failures leading to diminishing crops and lack of food. Projecting blame onto others reinforces each citizen's sense of participation in the totalitarian community and stills the nagging internal voice demanding that he act as a self-responsible individual. The myth of external plotting also increases the individual citizen's feeling of dependence and immaturity. Now only his dictatorial leader can protect him from the evil world outside, a world which is described to him as a vast zoo, inhabited by atomic dragons and hydrogen monsters. The strategy of criminalization. As we said before, the citizen of totalitaria may be able to fulfill some of his irrational instinctual needs in return for his submission to totalitarian slavery. Hitler Germany taught us the accepted pattern. The citizen and party member is encouraged to betray his friends and parents, something the angry, frustrated baby in him has often wanted to do. He may live out in action his deeply repressed aggressions and desires for revenge. He no longer has to suppress or reject some of his own primitive impulses. The system assumes the full burden of his guilt and hands him a ready-made list of thousands of justifications and exculpations for the release of his sadistic impulses. Flowery catchwords such as historical necessity help the individual to rationalize immorality and evil into morality and good. We see here the great corruption of civilized standards. In his strategy of criminalization, the totalitarian dictator destroys the conscience of his followers, just as he has destroyed his own. Think of the highly learned and polished Nazi doctors who started their professional life with the Hippocratic Oath, promising to be the helping healer of man, but who later in cold blood inflicted the most horrible tortures on their concentration camp victims. They slaughtered innocents by the thousands in order to discover the statistical limits of human endurance. They infected other thousands as guinea pigs because the Führer wanted it so. They had lost their personal standards and ethics completely and justified all their crimes through the Führer's will. Political catchwords encouraged them to yield their consciences completely to the dictator. The process of systematic criminalization requires a deculturation of the people. As one of Hitler's gang men said, "When I hear the word civilization, I prepare my gun." This is done to consistently arouse the instinct of cruelty. People are told not to believe in intellect and objective truth, but to listen only to the subjective dictates of the Moloch state, to Hitler, to Mussolini, to Stalin. Criminalization is conditioning people to rebellion against civilized frustrations. Show them blood and bloody scapegoats, and 1,000 years of acculturation fall away from them. This implies imbuing the people with hysteria, arousing the masses, homogenizing the emotions. All this tends to awaken the brute Neanderthal psyche in man. Justify crime with the glamorous doctrine of race superiority, and then you make sure the people will follow you. Hitler knew very well what he was doing when he returned the German concentration camps over to the unleashed lusts of his stormtroopers. Let them kill and murder was the device. Once they have gone so far with me, they must go on to the end. The strategy of criminalization is not only directed toward crushing the victims of the totalitarian regime, but also toward giving the elite hangmen, the governing gang, that poisonous feeling of power that drags them farther and farther away from every human feeling. Their victims become people without human identity, merely speaking masks and egoless robots. The strategy of criminalization is the systematic organization of the lower passions in man, in particular in those the dictator must trust as his direct helpers. Under the pressure of totalitarian thinking, nearly every citizen identifies with the ruling gang, and many must prove their loyalty by murder and killing, or at least expressing their approval of murder and killing. The boredom of totalitarian's automatic patterns of living leads the deluded citizens to welcome the adventure of war and crime and self-destruction. Each new act of torture and crime makes new bonds of fidelity and unscrupulous obedience, especially with the leading gang. In the end, driven by crime and guilt, the ruling members have to stick it out together, because the downfall of the system would bring about the downfall of the entire gang, both leaders and followers. The same thing holds true in the criminal world. Once a man has taken the first step and rejected the laws of society and joined the criminal gang, he is at war with the outside world and its moral evaluations. From that point on, the gang can blackmail him and subdue him. In totalitaria, the vicious cycle of criminalization of the citizenry, in which the means becomes ends in themselves, grows into a cynical conspiracy covered with the cynical flag of decent idealism. The country's leaders use such simple words as the Universal Campaign of Peace, and the citizens rejoice and take pride in these words. Only a few among them know what deceptive deeds lie behind the flowery phrases. And I think I'll stop it right there, and then we'll pick this up in the next video. That was part 3, and I'll see you in just a little bit. We're reading from The Rape of the Mind by Juste A.M. Merleau.